Welcome back. I'm here with Gillian Mandich, who's one of my favorite people. We actually went to the same university together, and what you had to do in university is fascinating to me because you had to invent the program.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
So I am so happy to be here and hello. So I'm a happiness researcher. And usually when I tell people that, they kind of look at me funny and like they wonder if I have a real job, right?
Right.
Which is a fair question because to be honest, up until the second year of my PhD, I didn't even know you could study happiness. But my interest is in health and health science. So, like you said, I went to Western. I did 3 degrees there, all in the Faculty of Health Science. And halfway through my PhD, I switched from this is like back when we first met. I was studying childhood obesity, and I
I
switched
don't even
halfway
know how
through.
we met. It was
I
like
know,
20 years ago now.
I know, we're getting old. But nobody in my faculty or at the university was studying happiness,
Which is
and
crazy to me.
that is
Like
mind-boggling,
it's
right?
it's crazy to me how little research, I mean, now there's more, but how little research there was done in this field to something
It's
that's so central to our
shocking.
being.
That so basically up until about the mid 90s there was very little peer reviewed research on happiness. So up until then we were focused on disease, what's wrong, what isn't going well, how do we fix things. And it really wasn't until Martin Seligman came along in the mid 90s and created what's often referred to as positive psychology. So, looking at sort of the
Oh,
other side of things that we've seen this exponential increase in the work, because I think we're understanding that life isn't just about getting to baseline, right? We get one shot at life, and how do we take the best shot
right.
possible? I actually did a podcast a while ago with another guest who's on this series with us, Dr. John Berardi, and I loved during our conversation. He called it. It's sort of like a baby, like it's a baby science, right? We're just sort of
Hmm.
in the infancy stages of it, and we've learned so much in the past, 20, 25 years. And because I think the pandemic, one of the silver linings is that we understand how important our mental health is, and so we're really curious, and there's that hunger for people to know, like, how do I feel better? How do I not feel sad or anxious all the time? And so that's what I research, and I think I have the best job ever. I'm biased, but I have to say it makes me happy.
I mean, you have to figure out how to be happier than you already are.
Yeah. And like a lot of researchers study things that are personally relevant as well. And I remember when I was switching from childhood obesity to happiness, I started reading a lot of research that sort of, because I look at things through a health lens, I
Mhm.
was looking at the difference between happy people and less happy people, and reading research that said, happy people compared to less happy people have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. They have stronger immune systems. They heal faster from injury. They tend to make better nutritional choices. They tend to sleep better, both in terms of duration and in terms of quality. And so a lot of the behavioral things that we're looking at when we think about how do we live a happy life or a healthy life, we see them increase when we're happier. And
Right.
so that in and of itself was a really good reason, I think, to start studying happiness. And at the same time, reflecting on my own life, I was thinking, okay, like, are you as happy as you possibly could be? I mean, at the time I was going through a divorce, so like the answer was no. But I wanted to learn, and I wanted to figure out, like, how can I be happier? And my one of my regrets is that I never measured my happiness when I first started studying happiness. So anecdotally, I think that I'm
Interesting.
happier now because I apply the things that I read about in research. But I wish I would have collected that data point. The researcher in me was like, oh, but I definitely have to say that learning about this has really opened up my eyes to know that we can actually do something about our happiness. I
And
think that
that's
that's empowering.
that's the point to me. We
Mm-hmm.
can actually do something about this. I cannot think of a more important field to study.
And so, what was interesting was when the field first started, researchers sort of thought we had like this set point. So sort of like a thermometer in a room, right? So
Right.
we sort of have our level of happiness. And then something good happens and it goes up a little bit and we go back to our set point, the temperature in the room. And then something bad happens and it goes down and then it sort of goes back up. But we know more now. And what we
Mhm.
know now is that when we think of sort of our total capacity for happiness, the top three biggest players are one, genetics. So they do
Right.
play a role.
Really?
But I think the important piece of this, and it's a significant role, but the conversation doesn't end there. That is not the moral of the story. That is not the
You're
period at
not
the
you're
end of the
not screwed
sentence.
if your genetics, if your happiness genetics at
Exactly.
that. How
Some
do you
people,
measure your happiness genetics? Can we talk about that first?
So
How
that's
do
a
we
tricky
figure
thing.
out where we are there?
So what's really hard with a lot of sort of the behavioral psychology piece is that we can't just put people in a randomized control trial and control for everything, right? We do more experimental, observational. We try to match participants on different characteristics to get a better sort of sense of happiness. But a lot of this sort of work comes from twin studies. So researchers take
Oh.
genetically identical, so monozygotic twins that are separated at birth. And so this is kind of the best that we can do where you have two individuals with the same genetics raised in different environments. So again, it's not a perfect measure, but it's sort of the best that we can do given that we're humans and we live our life. But for me, when I read that research, I think that's interesting information and good information, but there's more to the story. So another big factor in terms of our happiness is our environment. And I think all of us that have lived through a global pandemic really understand, yes, our environment affects. I mean, you know this, you go away every winter from Canada because the environment is not fun here in the winter, right? It affects our mood and how we feel. And then there's a third piece. And this is the piece that my research focuses on because it's the piece that's most amenable to change. So that's our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. And what we know from research is that not only is it possible to increase our happiness temporarily or in the moment, but when we start to practice practice happiness, the habit of happiness, it's almost like we can sustain it at higher levels for an extended period of time. So we aren't just born with a certain amount. I think the take home message is yes, no matter how happy or unhappy you're feeling joining us right now, knowing that you actually have the capacity to be happier than that.
I cannot think of anything that's more important to study
Mm-hmm.
than little bits of how to be happy. And it's something that I've read as much as I could find about it. Like, there still isn't a lot of, call it popular, accessible
Mm-hmm.
materials that are out there. I mean, I'm not sitting there reading research like you are. The first the first person who I came about on this was Daniel Gilbert,
Mm-hmm.
was stumbling on
Yeah.
happiness, and then
Harvard. Yeah.
who's fantastic as well. But I want to give some examples
Mm-hmm.
of things that we can do that are very easy, of how perhaps we spend money or don't spend money, how we manage vacations, time
Mm-hmm.
off, celebrations. And correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it comes down to understanding this idea of the hedonic treadmill or hedonic adaptation. For people who
Yeah.
don't know what that is, can you describe it a little bit?
I sure can. And before we get to the hedonic adaptation piece,
Yes.
one thing that I wanted to share first that like I had to learn when I first started studying happiness, I realized once I got into the literature that I had no idea what happiness actually was.
Huh.
And it's
What is
because
it?
if you think about it, none of us were taught how to be happy growing up in school,
No.
right? And then we
No.
have marketing and we have media and social media and magazines and TV all telling us what happiness is. So
Which is
we
all
sort of
largely superficial and short term and right.
exactly, which is going to tie into the hedonic treadmill in a second. But
Mhm.
first, I think that I had to learn what happiness was. And, you know, a lot of us, myself included, I used to think I will be happy when fill in the blank, right? When I have X amount of dollars, when I get married, when I get divorced, when I get my dream job, dream house. And so, two things on that. One, what we know from research is that, say you get that thing, you get that promotion, that car, that partner, that whatever it is, it does not bring you as much happiness as you anticipated that it would. And two, that happiness does not last as long as you anticipated that it would.
But isn't
So,
the anticipatory phase almost like 2/3 of the pleasure?
so a lot of times when we look specifically at some of the research in terms of planning a vacation,
Yeah.
people actually get joy out of the planning and the anticipation of
Yeah.
it for a variety of reasons. One, we get to think about it and imagine it. Two, we're actually not living it yet because we always have these like dream ideas of the perfect vacations, right? And then when they actually happen, our flight's delayed
Yeah,
and,
sure.
the air conditioning's not work, whatever it is.
I
So,
drank the
yeah.
water and it made me sick or whatever. That's what I always tell people. I'm like, if you want to enjoy your vacation as much as possible, pay in full as far in advance as possible.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like that's the best way. And I always thought about this with restaurants and stuff like that, and
Hmm.
massages and like enjoyable experiences. It's like,
Hmm.
why do you pay afterwards? I would think if I was designing that experience, I would want somebody to pay beforehand
Yeah.
and enjoy the experience and not worry about the painful part of it
Hmm.
after
Yeah.
you're done, because then
Right.
it takes away from the actual thing.
Yeah, and the money is another good one we can chat about after we cover the
I
hedonic
want
treadmill.
to.
But
Yeah, I
first,
want
sort of
to.
back to this idea of I will be happy when, right? We think this a lot.
Mm.
But what we know from research is that happiness is not a destination. It's not something we arrive at one day in the future if X, Y, or Z happens. And one, this is a particularly problematic thought because if we think that I will be happy when, what that does is it puts our happiness on something contingent on something that may or may not happen in the future.
Oh,
So,
okay.
what we know from research is that happiness, a big piece of our happiness, is a habit and it's a skill. So, part of happiness is changing what we think about it and seeing happiness through the same lens that we see physical activity or that we see nutrition. And what I mean by that is that you would never go to the gym today and have the best workout of your life and then text me after and be like, hey Jill, I just had the best workout of my life. I PR'd my deadlift, whatever, I've reached fitness. Right? You would
I've
never
never
say
sent
that
you a
to me.
message like that.
No, I've never received that and I do not anticipate that I will. Because
I'm
you
done.
know
I'm done now. I don't need to go back.
you know that if you want to be fit and healthy, you have to move your body on a regular basis
Right.
for your entire life.
Yeah.
And so, right, we
And
understand
big
that.
extreme things. I would even go so far with fitness. I don't know happiness as much, but with fitness, detract often from it.
Yeah.
Either you don't look forward to it, so you put it off, or you don't do it as often, or you need to recover from it so much so that you don't do it as often,
Mhm.
or you get injured because you push it a little bit too much, or whatever, right? Like it could actually detract
Right.
from
Yeah.
being
Overtraining, just
overall
like
fit.
anything. One of the things that's interesting about happiness, just as a quick aside, is that so people think that because I study happiness, I'm happy all the time. I
Mm.
didn't realize this until when I was going through a breakup last summer. People kept getting confused when I was telling them I was sad. They're like, how can you be sad? You study happiness.
Right.
And part of happiness, to your point about too much, it's impossible to be happy all the time. And so, what we see in research, sometimes it's referred to as like the dark side of happiness, where people that sort of put happiness as their number one goal and they're trying to be happy all the time, those people are actually less happy than other people. So, paradoxically, part of happiness is just like
Right.
fitness, right? We can't train all the time. And with happiness, we can't be happy all the time either.
Yeah.
Like, part of being a human is understanding we have a full spectrum of emotions. And in terms of healthy psychological functioning, we can't be happy all the time and we
Is
have
it
all these different emotions.
is it a comparison? I read a fair bit of Dr. Rollo May way back when, and he would always talk about it. Is one of his books, Psychology and the Human Dilemma. And he
Mhm.
spoke quite a bit about how emotions and happiness he included in this. Now, this is way before there was any real research, right? But he spoke about emotions, and happiness was bunched in there, being being referential. Like you could only experience true happiness if you experience sadness, and actually, the lower the low, the higher the potential high. And happiness is not something where we're like, boom, I'm happy. It's like you only feel happy because you understand what it's like to feel sad,
Mhm.
and you know that you're not there right now. Has that played out? Is that a thing, or was that like psychology of the 1970s type thing?
Yeah. So, what you're referring to is sort of the emotional range, right?
Yeah.
And so, what we see is like, think about it. If you were happy all the time, you have no point of reference to what it's like to feel sad. And what's interesting is, a lot of times when we are put in difficult situations, which we would not choose on our own, it's only in hindsight looking back that we see that we've been sort of put in a situation where we were forced to grow or to try something new that we've never done
Right.
before. And so the key piece is that whatever we're feeling, that we feel it. Oftentimes I hear people label emotions, positive emotions, negative emotions. And I try to stay clear of those labels because emotions aren't inherently good or bad. They're data, right? They're information.
Hmm.
If if you didn't submit something on time at work and you were accountable and you feel anxiety, is that a bad thing? Right? It's sort of keeping you in checks and balances. Or so it's not about it being good or bad. It's that they're like, even stress, right? Some level of stress in some acute situations can actually be beneficial. But if we're stressed all the time and it's chronic, it's different. So tapping into our emotions, and I think really understanding, like you said, if you've never gone through really hard things, then it's hard to know other things, right? We're humans that live our experiences, and then we have points of reference which help us to sort of navigate how we're feeling.
Another question, because these are all things that I think about when I think about things.
I love it.
To your point, this idea of um, experiencing hard things.
Mm-hmm.
It's always seemed to me kind of this funny quirk where I love experiences. I love going on adventures, the same as you.
Yeah,
We've
we're the same.
just laughed so hard about all the ridiculous stuff that both of us have done so many times. But even the really bad things, like the objectively bad things that have happened, I'm actually look back on and I think about and I'm just like, wow, I was actually really happy that happened because it brings me so much pleasure to talk about how bad that was. And it's like, it seems like even bad experiences give you a lot of pleasure, arguably more pleasure than good experiences, because of how much fun they are to talk about with friends afterwards about how bad the thing was. Is that a thing, or is that just John Goodman's weird brain?
It gives you stories, right? And
Yeah.
stories are a way to connect. And this actually sort of dovetails back to close the loop on hedonic adaptation that we had talked about. So hedonic adaptation is just essentially, as humans, we're adaptive creatures. And so no matter what happens, positive, negative, good, bad, happy, unhappy, we sort of, it happens and we get that spike. So say something good happens and our happiness increases. It doesn't stay there forever. Slowly over time, it starts to decrease. So that decrease is adaptation, hedonic adaptation. So it's not that we can get rid of hedonic adaptation, but what we can do is we can slow the curve. So we can take the slope and we can allow that to last longer. So the area under the curve is greater in terms of our happiness. But hedonic adaptation, to your point earlier, it goes both ways. So something good happens, you get a new car, you get a promotion, your happiness increases. But then, a couple weeks later, are you leaving garbage in your car? Probably. But it goes the other way too, where, you go through a breakup or a divorce or a job loss, right? Your happiness plummets, but you don't stay there forever. Slowly over time, hedonic adaptation brings you the other way. So it's not a question of like, can we get rid of it? It is part of the human experience. But what we can do is slow that curve. And a couple ways we can do that is, one, introduce variety. Because as humans, we're creatures of habit, right? Most of us get in our car and drive the same route, the same way, whether we're going to work or the gym. So even just mixing things up, we find that hedonically interesting. And so, really looking at variety. What can I do for variety? And we know this in fitness, right? You can't just do the exact same exercise every single day and that's it, right? We need to do different things, work different body parts, maybe try different exercises, right? One exercise all the time is not going to work. And also what we can do is along those same lines, and this is a really fun one, is introduce the element of surprise. And I love this because surprise is tricky in that you can't plan a surprise, because inherently, what is a surprise? It's an unplanned thing, right? But what we can do is we can put ourselves in situations where surprises are more likely to occur. So like you said, like introducing that variety, you take a different way to work. Maybe you see, some beautiful plants along the way, or you pass a friend, or who knows. It's actually really funny. As a quick aside, I gave the opening plenary for the American Society of Addiction Medicine this year.
What's a plenary? Talk to somebody. I lift stuff up and put it down for a living, and I can't count to 7. What's a plenary?
The sort of opening keynote for the conference. So it was in DC, 2,300 addiction medicine physicians. And I opened the addiction medicine conference talking about happiness.
What?
So that was fun. But I was talking about this hedonic adaptation and slowing the curve. And I was talking about the element of surprise. And so the next day, one of the things because I travel a lot for work, for speaking, I used to just sort of fly in, fly out. And now I try to at least leave like one day to go see something,
Yeah.
or to go check out a museum or go to a beach or do something while I'm there. And so I'd never been to Washington, D.C. before. So obviously I wanted to go see like the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, right? And so what I did was I went with a couple psychiatrists from CAMH here in Toronto, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And so we went and we saw the Lincoln Memorial. We kind of walked the Forrest Gump, up the
Yep.
sort of the thing up to the top to the Washington Monument. And then we wanted to take a photo. And the way the sun was, so if you're facing the Washington Monument, the White House is on your left. And so we had to turn because of the sun so that our back was to the White House.
Okay.
And so we take our photo, really cute, and then we look over and there's like a 50-foot blow up Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle walking
Perfect.
down the street by the White House.
Yeah. Perfect. Why wouldn't it be?
I look at one of the psychiatrists and they say to me, element of surprise. And I was like,
Right.
yes, exactly. So we can't plan for surprise, but we can do things that are more likely, put ourselves in new situations, try new things, talk to a stranger, read something new. All of these things can have, when you get that surprise, it can help to slow that curve as well of hedonic adaptation.
So I have a rule. Allison and I both have a rule, but it's mostly mine. She doesn't follow it as much because she doesn't care as much. But the rule is never Google it.
Ooh,
And this has come about, as you know,
fun.
we travel a ton and we spend a lot of time living abroad, but also just like have traveled a ton. We've done incredible hikes and treks and seen beautiful things. And what I started to realize was that I'd get to a place and I would get there and everybody else would be looking around like, oh yeah, this looks like the pictures, or like, oh yeah, this looks like the postcard. And I'd be like, holy shit, this is amazing. And they're like, you're looking in the wrong direction. Like, it's just never Google it. Never Google reviews. Never Google pictures. Never look at how something is supposed to look. That, wherever you go, it doesn't have to be a big thing traveling. Like, even if you go to a restaurant, like, I don't Google it. I don't look at what dishes you're supposed to get. My rule when I go to a restaurant is I open up the menu, and the first thing that looks good, I choose it and I close the menu, and I don't look at the rest of the menu because I don't want, if that thing comes and it's great, fantastic, right? But if that thing comes and it's not that good, then I'm not enjoying my meal because I'm worried or I'm thinking about all the other things that I should have ordered.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't know about all that other stuff, there's no comparison. I don't feel that guilt. I think there is a lot of ways in our everyday life to maintain that element of surprise, even as we're going around our same thing. Just like, I don't know, you said, just talking to somebody or asking somebody how they're doing or whatever it is. It's amazing what you learn about people sometimes too.
Oh, yeah. And you're really sort of alluding to something that I think is important to know about happiness, which is that, we often think it's the big shiny moments that bring us the most amount of happiness. But what we know from research is that if we want to live a happy life, and I think if you're listening to this conversation right now, you're interested in living a happy life, it's really about creating small bursts of happiness throughout the day. And when I say small, I mean small in terms of time or effort, not necessarily in terms of impact.
Yep.
Because when we start to add up those small things cumulatively over time, that actually adds up to more happiness. And what's interesting about that is it's these small things, right? Like you said, like talking to a stranger or taking somewhere new to work or, going to a restaurant you've never heard anything about and having the element of surprise you. In and of itself, that one moment, is a very small thing. But if you have more of those moments, that's actually what adds up to a happier life. And the other thing I love about this is that instead of making happiness contingent, like I said, on something in the future, right? Like I will be happy when, it's now taken it and it's brought it to something that we can actually do something about today, because each and every one of us can look at our day that we're living today and think, what's one more thing at some point in my day that I can do that makes me happy? Whether it be after this call, I'm going to take my little French bulldog who is snoring behind me. By the way, if you're listening and hear snoring at any point of this podcast, John's not putting me to sleep. It's my French bulldog, Jocko. We'll go for a little walk. Oh,
Mm,
I just said the word and he didn't wake up, so he's deep in sleep.
good.
But it's 15 minutes. We'll go for a quick little spin, and it doesn't seem like a lot of time, but the 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. When we actually look in terms of the research of what constitutes a happy life, it's someone that creates more opportunities for these small bursts. Because one,
Yeah.
that not only do they add up, they also um, create what we call upward spirals of positive emotion. I think a
Ooh.
lot of us are more familiar with like the downward spirals, right? The
I
anxiety
feel like that's a
spirals.
great name for a book.
Yeah. Totally. It's like you have one thought and then like all of a sudden the world is ending or like you're dying or something, right? The spirals more naturally for a lot of us go that way, but they also go the other way. It's like if you get a nice email from someone just thanking you for something you did, the next email that you reply to, you have a bit more like pep in your step. You're a little bit
Yeah.
happier, right? That's the upward spiral. So, really focusing on, okay, well, what's one thing I can do? And what we know about the psychology of behavior change is like, it doesn't happen overnight, but habits build over time. So that one thing that you do every day after a while becomes two, and then it becomes three. And now we're into the whole habit territory, right? But that's
Well, I
really
think
what it
about
really looks like.
designing your space, and you talk about like, you hear all the time about lifestyle design and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? And it's kind of become one of those bastardized words that doesn't mean anything anymore. Talk about like functional fitness or whatever. It's just like
Yeah,
the
I know,
word just
right?
means nothing anymore because marketers have ruined it. But
Mm-hmm.
where you live to me is such an important factor for overall well-being, and it's something that very few people think about. They live where they've always lived, right? and
Mm-hmm.
and we're told to buy a house and whatever at a very very young age for the most part. That's kind of how a lot of us were brought up. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to make an argument over whether that's a good financial or not a good financial decision, but I just think you don't know enough about yourself yet and what you want, what makes you happy, to decide where you live. Because once you buy a house, you're not stuck there, but like
It's a lot
odds
harder.
are you're not going anywhere.
Yeah,
And one of the things that our family has done, as you know this, Gillian, is
I know.
I've lived in
Yeah.
something like 12 countries now. I mean, we've traveled 4 to 6 months every year for the last 12 years now.
Yeah.
And I've lived in the most beautiful, exotic locations. Up the hill, 180 degrees vista, great big, beautiful condo on an island in Thailand, sunset view, nobody else around, right? Um, and then I've lived in uh, and then I've just lived in little towns across Central South America and little local towns and stuff. And what I found overwhelmingly very much aligns to what you said, which is I am far happier in the little towns. And when I thought about it, the amount of positive micro interactions that I had over the course of the day. In a lot of cases, I didn't even speak the same language as these people. These weren't conversations. These were smiles, waves, hola, awareness. We recognize each other because we've seen each other every single day for whatever it is, because we are in the same little pueblo, for months and months and months and months and months. And when it came time for our family to buy a house, I have a lot of friends, as you do, that bought big houses in the middle of the country with big properties. And
Yeah.
a big part of me fantasizes about that. But I know I'd be miserable there. When we
Mm-hmm.
went to buy a house, we bought a house in a very close, tight knit community. We have a good amount of space,
Mm-hmm.
but like, God, we love our neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
We knock on our neighbor's door and take our dog for a walk.
Yeah.
I mean, the kid across the street runs over and plays with Calvin. Like,
You were telling me that. Yeah.
you
It's
can't
amazing.
beat that kind of stuff. And so it's like, well, rent the big house,
Mm-hmm.
in the
Yeah.
country
Yeah.
for a week. Um, and get that and enjoy it. So it very much aligns. And I think that why I love this conversation so much is there's no right or wrong, I think,
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, but there
Yeah.
is very much a science to this.
There is. It's interesting because there's no like magic formula for happiness. And this is actually like, so I'm supposed to be writing a book right now about happiness.
You
But
should
when I
call it the magic
really
formula for happiness.
I know I'm like successfully procrastinating right now because I basically, if I really think about it, the idea of writing a book to tell somebody how to be happy
Yeah.
is a disempowering thought because I can't tell someone how to be happy. Like I
Oh,
can say
but you
this is
could
what the
talk
research
about
says and this is what
self
the
care,
but it's
variety, autonomy, and tell
yeah, and
stories
these
about that,
are
right?
factors that may or may not, but the piece of it is that we have to understand that happiness part of it is that we have to do it ourselves. And the only person that can tell us what makes us happy is ourselves. And it's shocking to me the amount of times in a research setting when I ask somebody what makes you happy, that they really have to think about the answer.
Mm.
Because I think for a lot of us, you ask everybody, do you want to be happy? They say yes. But then do we actually take the time to think about what are the things in our life that make us happy? So
Even the
step number
people who
one,
say yes, are they doing it?
right. And so step number one, I think a lot of times before we start to do more things to be happy, I sort of say, like, instead of initially seeking, like going out and SEEK, seeking happiness, part of it is seeing it right now in our life, really appreciating the little things that we take for granted. And this is one of the silver linings, I think, from the pandemic, from a happiness researcher's perspective, is that before the pandemic, when I would ask people, because I ask people all the time, like, what makes you happy, right? Before the pandemic, I would ask that, and people would say things like, oh, the vacation I just got back from, or oh, my new purse, or my new house, or whatever. Now, when I ask that question, more frequently, I'm hearing things like going for dinner with a friend,
Yeah.
having coffee with my mom, giving someone a hug. So, a lot of the things that we sort of took for granted when they were removed or taken away or temporarily suspended, we realized, oh, wait, there was actually a lot of things in my life that made me happy that I didn't quite realize. And so that is a silver lining, is I think we have a deeper appreciation for maybe some of those things that we took for granted before that actually do contribute to our happiness in a meaningful way, but we just never realized it.
I want to read you a phrase from the book that I'm
Yay.
writing, which is called The Obvious Choice. And I mean, I don't know if this is going to make it into the final book, but it kind of hits on what you were talking
Oh,
about.
I'm excited.
This is a chapter that's called Algorithms Change, Humans Don't. And it's about how to cope with technological disruption. And the way to cope with it is you focus on the human who uses the technology, not the
Mm-hmm.
technology.
Mm.
And because at the end of the day, that's what matters. Anyway, this phrase, this is like near the end of the chapter, but whenever there's technological disruption, I think about it like it's the start of winter and it sucks outside and the sun starts going down at 5:30 and you can look out your window and be sad and grumpy. Or you can invite friends over and share blankets and drink hot chocolate and watch terrible movies and make fun of how lame they are. Both of these are ways to deal with bad weather, but one's great and the other sucks. Ultimately, our response to things out of our control is our choice.
I love
That to
that.
me is like I love that. There's a way that I think I want to spin the bad movies a little bit. I was thinking it's too long, but I was like, and you watch bad movies and you laugh at how corny it is because when she took her ponytail off, she was a supermodel. But but it's like too long, so I might spin. But it's that idea of just going back and really enjoying those small things. And what are those small things for you? There was a process I heard about. This is from Jim Collins, the business writer, and he recommended a process called a bug book that I did.
Mm.
And the idea behind it is, what if we study ourselves as if we are a bug? How much time have you actually, I mean, this is nothing new, know thyself.
Yeah.
But how much time have you actually spent studying yourself? And what he recommended is this. And I went through the process and it was really meaningful for me. And he says, you keep a journal and you give yourself a score from -2 to +2. So -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. And you can go on the halves. So -2, -1.5, whatever. And that's based off of how you're feeling at any given time. And it's purely objective. It's purely subjective, I'm sorry. How you're feeling at any one point in time. And you have an alarm that goes off. You do this a minimum of a week, but you do this for enough time for it to matter. And you have an alarm that goes off eight periods over the course of a day. And all that you do in your book is you have the time, you write down the score of how you're feeling. I'm a 1 right now. And then you write down any important things. So like what you're doing, who you're with, whatever, right? And then at the end of the week, you look at your book and you look at where all the -1s and the -2s are, and you look at where all the 1s and all the 2s are.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts to paint a very clear picture of where you're fired up and where you're not.
I love that, right? That brings the awareness piece in too, like to where we were just talking about, like what makes you happy, right? So this is essentially like in research, we call that experience sampling. So we just sort of
Okay.
tap in. Sometimes in research now with happiness, we'll use data collection on a phone. So we'll send push notification and say, same as a timer. It can be done either way. We're just like, how are you feeling? Select the emoji or
Oh, that's
whatever.
cool.
But the value in that
That'd be an
exercise,
app. I bet you this app would sell really well. Call it like the bug app.
yeah, have a cute little bug emoji as the picture, you know.
Let me write
But
that
what's
down.
great about that is it brings some awareness. And a lot of times we think about what can I do to be happier? I get asked that. That's like the number one question I get asked. But sometimes the question is, what can I stop doing
Yeah.
or do less frequently or, do spend less time, right? Because sometimes not doing the things that detract from our happiness can also contribute to us feeling happier. And it can be anything from like I hate going to the grocery store. I don't like it. I don't like cooking. I don't like going. I don't like waiting in lines. And so, for like $10, I can get my groceries delivered. And the amount of happiness that I get from that to stop going to the grocery store, not only to get some time back, but I don't have to do something I don't like. And
That's
so
the biggest
sometimes it's
hack when
little
you
things.
travel.
Yeah,
Is order groceries to where you're staying so that they're
that is
there
a
when you leave.
very good one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes it's about what can I subtract or, what can I do less often or what can I outsource? Time affluence, sort of touched on time, money at the
Mhm.
beginning. Money does not buy happiness, right? More money doesn't bring more happiness. Researchers fight around like
I
X
was
amount
gonna
of
say,
dollars
is that
is the amount
true?
that you need.
Right. We all know the study that said $75,000, but it changed for cities. But then there was another study that basically
Yeah.
said,
Then
but
Matt
actually over
Killingsworth
10
came out.
million, maybe it does. So like,
So if you
what's
sort
the
of
research
like
say on that now?
take a zoom out, right, and you don't get lost in the weeds of one particular study, essentially the take home message is that once your basic needs are met, so you're not stressed about how you're paying your mortgage or your rent or how you're putting food on the table, like up until that point, yes, more money brings you happiness if
Mm,
that's the case. But once your basic needs are met, more money doesn't mean more happiness. But the one thing that money can buy is what we call time affluence. Time is a
okay.
non-renewable resource that we have. And so when we spend our money in different ways, it can bring more happiness. You talked about at the beginning, taking a trip. So experiences, like if you're thinking about giving a gift to somebody,
Yeah.
someone's going to get more happiness out of an experience, whether that be, you're going for dinner together or you're going to a play or to a movie or to a concert. The same amount of money that you'd spend on a gift, like some shoes or a shirt or whatever, people actually get more happiness from the experience because, like we talked about, one, we get the joy leading up to it. And then two, we have the experience. And then three, we have the memories and the photographs from that.
Right. Right.
Another one is, where you can buy back your time. Like I was saying, what does it take me a half an hour to go to the grocery store? If I can spend $10 and get it delivered and it takes me 5-10 minutes to organize it, I've just now found 20 minutes of time. And so when I can use that time and appreciate that time, that's a big one too.
Go for a walk with your
So there
dog.
are certain ways that you can spend your money to buy back things like time or to create experiences that will bring more happiness. But essentially, once our basic needs are met, it's like, have you read the book, The Psychology of Money by Morgan
Oh,
Housel?
that's a yearly read for me. Yeah.
So it's at the start of one of the chapters, and essentially he has like two billionaires. The story is of two billionaires, and they're sitting on an island and they're talking, and they're both billionaires, I believe, and they're talking about all the toys and the things that they bought. And the one guy's kind of listing off, his new jet, his new whatever, and then the second billionaire, who's slightly less wealthy of the two billionaires, okay,
Right. Right.
says to the slightly more wealthy one, he says, but I'll have one thing you'll never have.
Yeah.
And the wealthier billionaire says, well, what's that? And he says, enough.
And he says enough.
And
Yeah.
I think that that's a big piece. If we're always on this hedonic treadmill where we're chasing more and more and more, right? This I will be happy when, we never get there.
Yeah.
And so it's part of happiness is also really appreciating what we have. Like I talked about, the things we take, not seeking, but seeing, but also, what is enough, right? We see this in the entrepreneurial world all the time, right? It's like, if I get this, then this, and this, and it never ends. More zeros get added. You need a bigger house. You need another cottage, whatever it is.
You
And
just
so,
compare yourself to a different level of
yeah,
person.
exactly.
It's this endless thing where it doesn't matter how much money you have as long as you have more than your neighbor.
Yeah.
I used to joke about that. I didn't actually do anything about it, but like in university when I was still single, I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna try to meet a girl tonight. doesn't really matter how I look because she's just going to compare me to who else I'm with. So I just need to find somebody who looks like me but a little bit worse and bring them
Social
with me.
comparison.
And it's just, I mean, but these are the dumb games that our brains play. We can only compare things to other things that we see in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
and that is something that we need to kind of zoom out on all the time. Don DePani, who I think you know,
Yes.
is so we already spoke, so he's in here, and
He's amazing.
he's incredible, and he actually helped me years back figure out this idea of what is enough.
Mm.
And it's funny because he's a ex-Hindu monk, now Hindu priest, and you wouldn't expect him to say make a lot of money, but he effectively said that to me. He said the concept of enough is not a money thing.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
it's as long as you're doing things that you feel is right, as long as you don't feel like you've gotten yourself in some kind of a corner where you're forced to do actions that don't align with your morals
Mm-hmm.
or how you want to act, i.e. you're pressured to cheat or lie or steal or whatever. And as long as what you're doing is energizing to you,
Mm-hmm.
make as much money as you can.
Yeah.
But the
Well,
second it goes beyond that is when it
and
gets to be enough.
if money was the be all end all of happiness, so every year the World Health Organization, so March 20th is the International Day of Happiness. And so
Okay.
every year, it's a very busy day for me.
Yeah, you got interviews lined up through Zoo, I'm
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
it's my busiest day of the year. But the World Health Organization, every year they release a report and they rank the different countries in the world in terms of which country is the happiest.
Mm-hmm.
And so if money was the thing that brought the most amount of happiness, what we would see is the most affluent countries are at the top of the list, right?
Right. Right.
And we don't see that. Do you
Hmm.
know what countries rank at the top? Any guesses?
Oh, geez. I mean, I would guess they're across Europe, like some of the,
Yeah.
like Norway,
Bing, bing,
Switzerland.
bong. You
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it's sort of for the top is always a fight between like Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. The
Yeah.
Scandinavian countries always fight for the top. And so the question becomes, okay, well, why is that? Why do they get the top, right? And it's because the researchers look at a variety of different variables when they determine the rankings. And so, yes, money, gross domestic product, GDP is a
Right.
factor, but they also look at things like the healthcare system, the education system, the social system. They even ask a question. They ask, if you lost your wallet, how confident are you that you would get it back? And at first that might seem like a silly question, but what that's getting at is, the community, right? Trust
Right.
and things like that and safety.
That's
And
huge.
so all of those sort of come together to paint this picture. And so we do not see that the most affluent Canada actually ranks higher than the States in
Right.
this. But again, it's not like the third world countries that are living in poverty are all at the bottom either, right? Some of them rank high too, because it really isn't just about money. That's not the only factor when we
Well,
think about
Rory
it.
Sutherland, who's also involved in the summit, who's incredible, obviously in the UK, always tells this. He didn't say this in our interview, but he always talks about this. He goes, he always talks about the difference between Brits, and he always makes funny jokes. He's like, yeah, I mean, you want to know why Americans are so aggressive, and it's just like because everybody we didn't want we sent over there. Like that's what happened. But one of the things he says is, it's backwards what we measure. Like
Mhm.
countries compare themselves on GDP. But if you ask anybody in the UK, it's like, okay, well, we can actually improve the GDP. We can improve the gross domestic product of the UK by 2%, let's say. But instead of 6 weeks off vacation, you have to take 2 to match the United States. Would you be willing to do that? It's like,
Exactly.
nope,
Yeah.
nope. So
Exactly.
what do we do? Especially as we move into this world now where, look, the reality of it is there probably aren't enough jobs for the amount of people that can work because of technology, automation, and that will increase. So there's going to be a lot of people who can pursue a lot of passions, which I think
Hmm.
is wonderful. I think there's going to be an influx of various types of coaches. For example, I hired an urban vegetable gardening coach.
I love
Um,
it.
he's incredible,
That's so
Luai
cool.
Ghaffari, and he worked in middle management for a large multinational for a lot of years, and um, because of a lot of what I was able to do with tech, I had extra time, and so I
Mhm.
decided I wanted to grow more vegetables. His geeky obsession was he loves Toronto urban vegetable gardening, and I hired him as my coach. Like, to me, that's kind of the obvious choice, like job of the future, is people who call it own the machines are going to have a lot of excess wealth and time, and they're going to pursue a lot more hobbies and extra interests. And the people who don't own the machines, who don't need to work, are going to basically coach them on whatever their nerdy obsessions are. I think that's wonderful.
I'm a part of a hive share in Toronto. Have you heard of this?
No, is that
So
bees, honey?
beehives, yeah. So you
Oh,
you sort of
awesome.
a bunch of people, you split, and so they have hives that grow on top of some of the buildings here in downtown Toronto, and
Cool.
then at the end you get your honey from it. So because they do say, I've heard that, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've been told that the best honey is honey from around where you live.
Yep.
So
I'm
I guess
honey is like my thing. Like, you can ask Allison about this. The only thing I spend money on is honey.
honey,
Like, literally the only thing I care about that I spend money on is honey. And so anywhere that we go, any local farmers market or whatever it is,
honey.
honey is the only thing I buy.
You sparked something as you were just talking to,
What's
which I
that?
think is an important sort of caveat to this conversation, is that a lot of our conversation today is very much from a North American perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, what we see in terms of happiness, if we sort of look across the globe, is that different cultures interpret and express happiness differently too. So, if we think about, us here in North America right now, happiness is much more a personal pursuit. You think of goals, accomplishments, me, I did
Right.
this, that sort of perspective.
Right.
We jump across the pond and we go to Japan or China or something, over there, instead of the individualistic culture that we are here, we see more of a collectivist culture. So it's more community oriented. It's we, it's us. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that that's an important thing to remember too, because happiness is not just like a blanket thing across the world, and there are a lot of differences. And for me, what I think about is what I sort of touched on before, which is at the end of the day, for each and every one of us, digging into ourselves, right? Thinking about what makes me happy. How does, you talked about before, our environment and where we're born and a country that we're in impacts it, right? And it really does. So having some awareness around that and understanding that and recognizing that can be an important element. We're sort of taking a sort of bird's eye view of our happiness.
That's wonderful. Gillian, thank you so much for doing this.
This is so
This was
fun,
fun.
John.
We've
This is
never
so
geeked
fun.
out to this extent on this kind of stuff before out of all the
I
time we
know.
spent together. So this was cool. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Appreciate you doing this.